Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Drexler, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Salt Lake Community College, and this is the fourth episode of Porch Philosophy, a series that is dedicated to staying present and connected to the world even in the face of isolation, and to exploring what philosophy can offer a community under quarantine. We are now in week 7 of stay at home directives, and I find myself going through various phases. Like many days, I feel pretty energized. I feel optimistic. I'm working on projects. I'm redoing my garden. I'm designing my summer classes. I'm doing a lot of bike riding. But some days I feel anxious and restless, and I feel like boredom or anxiety or the stories I'm hearing of sickness and despair and uncertain futures and things like that, they start to feel pretty weighty, and I worry about being able to get out from under them. And so, as I've been thinking about these various experiences of comfort and discomfort, peace and pain, I thought that today would be a good opportunity to actually invite onto Porch Philosophy a friend of mine who wrote a whole book on the topic of suffering. Scott Samuelson is professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College, winner of the Hyatt Prize in the Humanities and many other honors, and is one of my favorite people to think with. Back in 2014 or so, he wrote this incredible book called The Deepest Human Life, which was part memoir of a community college professor, part love letter to his students and the world, and part introduction to philosophy. I highly recommend that book. You should totally read it. And in 2018, he published a second book, which you should also read, called Seven Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering. And he organized it around 7 different philosophical takes on how we understand and deal with suffering. And it includes chapters on Nietzsche and the Book of Job and Stoicism, and also, a last chapter on Sidney Bechet. And so for this Porch Philosophy, I thought I'd share some of the highlights from a conversation that I had with him a few days ago. There's actually an extended interview on my Vimeo channels, which shows more of the range of our conversations, but here I just want to highlight a few themes that came up. And so I started out by just asking him to talk for a few minutes about a distinction he makes in his Seven Ways book about a few approaches that we seem to have when we're dealing or responding to suffering. And after that, I thought I would highlight a couple of exchanges on the nature of wonder, on Marcus Aurelius, on the role of philosophy, and also what has struck him about doing philosophy under quarantine. And so here's Scott Samuelson explaining 3 different approaches to suffering, both acute and subtle, that we encounter in our lives.
I kind of have this threefold way of thinking about it. One way in which human beings deal with suffering is we try to fix it. That's pretty obvious, I think. Right now, with regard to COVID, we're trying to find a vaccine. People are trying to take reasonable precautions to prevent it. I think about my mom who spends her whole day, she's a seamstress, and she spends her whole day making masks and surgical caps and sending them off. And all that seems like a wonderful way of trying to deal with suffering, is to try to overcome it, try to fix it. But we can't fix all of it, and right now we can't fix much of it. So another way that we sometimes deal with it is what I call the forget about it way of dealing with suffering. We get so overwhelmed and we just want to check out. I suppose a lot of people are finding all sorts of ways of forgetting about the suffering right now, whether it's Netflix or a glass of wine. But I'm really interested in the third way of dealing with pointless suffering, which I call the face it way of dealing with it. So we have fix it, forget about it, and face it. And this to me is where a kind of special, strange part of our humanity really comes out. This is where we don't just run away from suffering, but somehow are present to this aspect of life. Religion often is a way of doing this for people. God allows them to face this suffering. Philosophy can give us tools to do this. Porch philosophy or stoicism allows us to be just present to the suffering and accept it and to try to integrate it into the best of who we are. I mean, one way to get into this is to think about it. Let's just say we only had the first 2 ways of dealing with things, fixing things as much as we can, and then just trying to forget about everything else. And I actually think that's a pretty common strategy that many people have right now, is they mostly spend their time on either fix it energies or forget about it energies. And I feel like if those are the only 2 things that we're ever doing or shuttling between, wanting to have a solution else, just not wanting to think about it, that we actually live in a kind of low grade, if not high grade anxiety all the time, that we just can't come to terms with the human condition itself. The fact is, there is death, there is suffering, there is sickness. And while, like I said, we have a complex relationship to it, it's just there. And so if we can't come to terms with that, whenever it presents itself, we're just sort of filled with anxiety. And I think a lot of people are dealing with that kind of stuff right now. So I actually think that these face it ways of dealing with it are ways of, in some sense, overcoming that anxiety. Like grief is a really good example. Sometimes just grieving the loss of something is a way of, you're just present to the suffering and you feel it and you allow it to overwhelm you. And, it hurts and it's painful, but it actually brings out something that makes us uniquely human. And that if we run away from that, we've run away from that part of our humanity. I mean, I think there is a deep paradox, and because on the one hand, we want to overcome suffering. That's just being human. You can't not want to. With regard to COVID-19, we want to get rid of it. And like I said, we spend a lot of energy to try to do just that. Great, wonderful, that's good. But I actually think, weirdly enough, there's something to be said for just saying, wow, there's a lot to learn from this, and respect and be in awe about it as well. There's a lot to be kind of in awe of with regard to our place in nature that can be learned from COVID-19. There's a lot in terms of the heroism that comes out of people and all this, that this is something that both brings out the best in us and also something we want to defeat. And it's a bit of a paradox, but there it is.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And you've been using that idea of awe that comes out of the face it. And I was hoping maybe you'd say a little bit more about that. That idea that philosophy begins in wonder, but the way that you're thinking about it, a lot of that wonder comes out of loss or collapse or grief or that. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how loss and suffering grounds wonder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when everything sort of makes sense, or when we have the tools to totally make sense of something and we just have to apply them, maybe we don't need philosophy. We just need good mathematics or helpful medicine or science or whatever. But we're constantly confronted as human beings with things that blow our minds. That's what I think of as awe. Things that just seem bigger than us and that expand us or that challenge us. One of the main ways I think that almost everyone experiences philosophy is in the face of suffering, in the face of loss and death, because those are things too that never fully add up for us, or that when they appear, they sort of blow our minds and overwhelm us. And I think philosophy also often comes out of collapse. When the structures that we have are just falling apart, we all of a sudden have to ask ourselves, oh my gosh, what do we need to do to go forward? And we don't have the tools. We have to invent them. We have to think into uncharted territory. One very clear-cut example of this in philosophy is ancient Chinese philosophy. Almost all of the great ancient Chinese philosophies arose during the falling apart of the Zhou dynasty, and eventually leading to what they called the Warring States period. So here's societies falling apart in front of their eyes, and all of this philosophy comes on board to say, who are we? How can we live well together? What are we supposed to do in the face of this?
Mm-hmm. I do think that it's pretty interesting, because normally when we think about grief and collapse and loss, it feels like imploding, right? Like that you are in such a deep well that it doesn't seem like you can get out of that well. And yet at the same time, wonder is this thing that connotes this flowering and being free, right? And so how do you think about that freeing in the midst of someone who really is just day to day trying to figure out how to keep breathing or to survive the loss of somebody?
Yeah, no, that's really well put, that idea of both imploding, but then also reaching out. I mean, this is the kind of wonderful thing about wonder, I suppose, is that for all the awe and mind-blowingness and scariness of it, I guess there is this little bit of hopefulness in it that says, I can think about this. I have the abilities to confront this stuff. I don't know what they are yet, but I'm going to do it. Rather than just simply shrinking inward, it's the sense of, I think I can think about this. I think I can be up for this, which is to me one of the most beautiful and dignifying things about philosophy. And that when people encounter philosophy, oftentimes they think, oh my gosh, I've had all of these thoughts before, but I've never really had a place where they could be recognized and extended, and I recognize that my wonderments are of a piece with the greatest minds of history.